tonight, with my sister from New York, we have the great honor to present to you the person you've all been waiting to hear. Reverend William Barber, your leadership and moral courage has been so inspirational to so many of us. And we thank you so much for coming out today to stand with the Working Families Party. So come on up here, come to the stage, please everyone. Let's give Reverend Barber the DC reception from all over the country that he deserves. Our brother, our leader, our warrior, Reverend Barber.
My. First of all, it's beyond good to be here and to be in the land of the living by the grace of God. And I keep hearing this thing about heroes, but my heroes are here. Chris, Mary Kay, Don, we thank you for this work, Cantor, with working families, CWA family, my SEIU family, my sister, whom I just met, and she feels just like a sister already beloved. My homeboy, Lionel Neptune, we grew up. We grew up about 10 miles from each other, went to the same high school with all his family. His sister graduated just before me, and he graduated, I think, 2 years before me. And they used to say that Plymouth was like Nazareth. Could any good thing come out of Plymouth? But I thank him for this opportunity and invitation to come and to share with all of you. Roz Pellis, my hero, who came down tomorrow, Monday, and hadn't left yet. And I'm just so thankful to be here. Even I see Mary over there, Kay, because we're cooking up a little something too. But you know, tonight, in all seriousness, I've been thinking about this theme. We must fight for the future of working families. 2,800 years ago, the prophet Isaiah spoke up about the fight for working families. And sometime I wish our elected officials who love to put their hands on the Bible would finally figure out what's in it. There's nothing in it about prayer in the schools. Nothing. There's not really anything in it about abortion. There are only about 4 scriptures in it that deal with the issue of sexuality, the way they talk about it, and those 4 scriptures never trump this scripture. You still have to love your neighbor as yourself. But there are over 2,000 texts in the ancient texts, 2,000 of them, that speak to the issue of justice and family and how you treat the least of these. In fact, if you were to cut all of those texts out of the Bible would not survive. It would literally fall apart. 2,800 years ago, Isaiah said in the 10th chapter, woe unto those, listen to this language, woe unto those who legislate evil. Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights, who write oppressive decrees that make widows and children and families their prey, fighting for the future of working families. 1912, a Republican got sick of both parties. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. Sick of both of them. and joined the progressive movement, and 1912 gave a famous speech, and he talked about fighting for families, and he challenged America to have a moral agenda. And in that moral agenda in 1912, he said a true moral agenda, a true progressive agenda in 1912 would be living wages, Social Security, health care, public education, labor rights, and environmental protection. That's why I say a lot of times to these people who have hijacked the Republican Party, you're not Republican because you don't even honor your founders like Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt. It's something, you're something strange. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his cousin, middle of the Depression, 1933, talked about a moral agenda. In fact, let me go back a second. Theodore also talked about a moral agenda had to include getting money out of politics. This is 1912. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1933, actually said in one of his fireside chats, don't you let any executive making $11,000 a week and turning his employees over to the government roles to be cared for in order to preserve the wealth of the stockholders tell you that something is wrong with the minimum wage of $11 a week. That's 1933. And 47 years ago, on March 14th, 20 days before Dr. King died, was murdered, and 19 days, Mary Kay, before Dr. King called in his final sermon. We need to lift this up rather than the one we often talk about. People often lift up the last part of I Have a Dream and they miss everything else. He said, but Dr. King's last sermon was this: why America may go to hell. And in that sermon, he was going to talk about, he had been talking about, it was the only thing he was talking about for about the last 2 years, from 67 to 68. He gave a speech at Grosse Pointe High School in Detroit. It was one of his last speeches, and he talked about, he said, every city in our country has a kind of dualism, a schizophrenia. He said there are two Americas. One America is beautiful for the situation. Millions of people have the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality flowing before them. They have food and material necessity for their bodies, their culture, their education, their minds. But then there's this other America. It's 47 years ago, this other America has a daily ugliness about it. And it transformed the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. And thousands of people have substandard housing and low education, not because they're dumb, not because they don't have native intelligence, but because their schools are so inadequate and overcrowded and so devoid of quality. And it was out of that context that he announced a people's movement. He was calling for the Poor People's March. Because like Isaiah, like the Roosevelts, King understood that in every age there has to be someone who will fight for working families. Now, remember though, that Dr. King in his book, Community or Chaos, talked about two forces he battled. And when I first read this, it shocked me. He talked about two forces he battled, Lionel, in the fight for family, in the fight for equality, in trying to deal with these two Americas. He said the first voice he had to fight, the first group he had to fight, were so-called liberals. Who thought that because he was black, he should stick with civil rights and not be engaged in economic justice. Because you can't have black folk leading economic justice issues because it'll turn off some white folk, and that's liberal racism. It's what I was told when we first started the Moral Monday movement. We'll do this, but you can't have the leader of the NAACP out in front of it. And Dr. King had to fight that. But he also had to fight, the other was the proponents of extremism and the white Southern strategy. And you can't understand where we are now without understanding how that strategy is still at work. That's right. You know, Kevin Phillips designed it for Richard Nixon. He told Richard Nixon, I can show you how to win the presidency, because you got to know how to pit people against one another. But you have to do it in a way unlike George Wallace, because you can't use the N-word. Lee Atwater ended up telling us that. You remember what he said? He said, listen, y'all grown, you can hear this. Because it's time for us to have a grown-up conversation about race. And right now, once again, the media is blowing it in trying to describe where we are right now, because they keep saying things about left-right. Some of this stuff is not about left-right. It's about straight-up racializing. Read George Wallace's 1968 speech at Madison Square Garden, where he talked about segregation, but also pointed out all of the white labor leaders that were in the audience supporting him and his wife. And you'll understand that all Trump is doing is the Wallace. And when you do the Wallace, you have to make somebody, I know y'all gonna be a little rough, but this is all right, the new nigger. Because Lee Atwater said in 1954, but you can't say the word. You can't say the N-word. Lee Atwater said, when he said, this is what we decided to do. We figured out in 1954, you can say N-word, N-word, N-word. But in 1968, you can't say N-word because that will backfire. So you have to learn a new lexicon. So you start saying things like, we're for force busing, states' rights, cutting taxes, holding back entitlements. He said, and none of this stuff sounds racist, but the byproduct of it is blacks get hurt worse than whites, and you teach whites, particularly in the South and in the suburbs of the North, that their problems are due to folk getting things that they should not have. And then Lee Atwater said, when you say we want to cut this, it doesn't sound racist. But the goal is to drive a wedge right down the middle of the soul of America. And Ronald Reagan used it to the T. 1980, when he did his second speech for the presidency, he started in Philadelphia, Mississippi. He didn't have to say anything. That's where Swanner and Goodman were killed. And he used every code word of the Southern strategy in that speech. Never said the N-word. Split America right down the middle, and particularly in the South, and won a landslide victory, even though his policies hurt white, working, poor families worse than anybody. And you cannot navigate through this moment we're in now without us talking about and dealing with this strategy. So I believe we need a reframing of moral issues. That's what Working Families is about, moral money is about. And because the strategy wants to do, the Southern strategy, is to limit moral issues to abortion, prayer in the school, and homosexuality. And as Tim Wise said, the third thing the Southern strategy wants to do, and it's not just Southern because it works in the suburbs of the North as well, is to racialize the very programs that actually helped the majority of white families in the 40s and 50s and caused people to vote against their own self-interest. And if you don't deal with this philosophy and its whole, because it's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's not left, it's not right, it's just mean. I note this history because when we can see a need to say, like Isaiah, woe again. Right today, we can see a need, like the Roosevelts, to call for a moral agenda. We can see again, if our eyes are open, the need for, like Dr. King, to talk about two Americas. We can see the need to unpack and challenge the constant reincarnation of the Southern strategy. In other words, we must still fight for working families. And there are at least 4 areas. Otto Schwammer says there's a blind spot in American economic theory today is called consciousness. Our refusal to have an economic theory that looks and sees that we are all integrated and we really need each other. If you're going to fight for working families, we have to deal with the consciousness of our economic theory. Right now, as we sit in here tonight, this evening, in the richest nation on earth, the richest nation ever in the history of the world, we have more poor people than at any other moment in our country's history, right now. And when you add to that the greatest gap between the rich and the poor since we started collecting the data 55 decades ago, our income inequality is documented to be the highest in the advanced world. We've also become the least economically mobile. So if you're born poor here, you're more apt to stay the same way. That's why I'm finally glad that some Democrats, some, not all, have at least begun to use the word poor. You know, they weren't using that word. Even the president, God bless him, he's done a lot of things, but this system doesn't want you to use the word poor. So you talk about things like the middle class, and sometimes we organizers make that same mistake too. We say, we're gonna work for those people who are trying to make it in the middle class. Well, some people are not trying to make it in the middle class. They're just trying to save what Jesus rode into Jerusalem on, and it rhymes with class. Every day, that's all they're trying to do. And when you get happy about 5% unemployment in a country of 400 million people, do you know that still means there are 20 million of God's children? We have lost the language of even wanting to talk about full employment. And until we do that, and really, the question is, are we going to be violent or nonviolent? Whether you're liberal or whatever, and I'm going to challenge that in a minute, but are you going to be violent or nonviolent? Because Coretta Scott King said it like this. When she was asked, what about violence, Ms. King? Your husband was shot and killed. She said, let me tell you something. Violence is more than a rifle bullet blowing your husband's head almost off. She said, poverty is a deadly kind of violence. She said, starving a child is violence. Suppressing a culture is violence. Neglecting school children is violent. Discrimination against a working person is violent. Ghetto housing is violent. Ignoring medical needs is violent. Contempt for equality is violent. And then she said, even a lack of willpower to help humanity is a sick and sinister form of violence. So the real question for us, as we organize this, are we going to say a little violence is all right? Or are we going to be totally committed to a nonviolent society that lifts the hopes and dreams of every family that's here? You know, the federal poverty guideline says that if you make $24,251, you're not poor in a family of four. So we have to be careful how we use the language of the empire when we celebrate. We can't simply merely say, well, you know, so many thousand people came out of poverty. No, they rose above the federal poverty line, which is off anyway and hasn't really been adjusted since the 60s, which means unless you talk about a living wage, you aren't really talking about dealing with poverty. Over the last 20 years, half the jobs in the nation pay less than $34,000 a year, according to the Economic Policy Institute. 25% pay below the poverty line. So it's not even just full employment, as Bill Lucy often said, because, you know, slavery was full employment. In fact, in 1868, when the fusion politicians took over the General Assembly in North Carolina and rewrote the Constitution because they knew that work without a living wage was still a pseudo form of slavery. In our Constitution in North Carolina in 1868, white and black fusionists put this language: we hold it to be self-evident that all persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the enjoyment of the fruit of your own labor and the pursuit of happiness. Any form of labor that doesn't allow you to enjoy the fruit, your labor has dignity, but what you're getting paid for that labor is not something of dignity until it's a living wage. We see this waste of human talent. Was that book, The Price of Inequality? Joseph Stiglitz says in 2000, the 400 wealthiest Americans took home an hourly wage of $97,000 an hour in 2009, and that they have the nerve to fight over 15. When in fact, we're fighting for 15, but the fight can't even end with 15. That's a beginning. You know, that's a beginning, right, Mary Kay? That's a beginning. I mean, it has to be a beginning. I know she's, you know, but I have to say that to y'all prophetically. You see, coming out of Egypt is not the end of your journey when you come out. You come out of Egypt, but you want to make it to the promised land. And if the Institute of Policy says that if the minimum wage had been properly adjusted since 1968, the minimum wage would actually be $21. Which is what some people are getting paid to flip burgers in other countries that don't have any black workers. You cannot have any discussion in America about economics that does not hook with the discussion about race. You're just fooling yourself. You're just fooling yourself. Columbia University's mailman of School of Public Policy did a study and found out that low levels of education, poor social support, and other social factors contribute to about as many deaths as heart attacks, strokes, and lung cancer. They said in 2000, I think it was 2004, that 119,000 people in America died from income inequality. And 245,000 died in 2000 because of low levels of education. And we haven't even talked about the greatest of our national moral disgraces that Mary Wright Edelman keeps lifting up. There are 14.7 million poor children and 6.5 million extremely poor in the United States. And if you take all of those poor children, they make up more than the population of 12 states in America. 12 states in America. Every other American baby is non-white, and 1 in 2 black babies is poor 150 years after slavery was legally abolished. And so we know that we could shrink overall child poverty by 60%, black child poverty by 72%, and we could improve economic circumstances according to the Children's Defense Fund for 97% of poor children if we just spent $77.2 billion on programs we know work, which is less than 2% of the federal budget. And we know that according to the census in 2013, and this is something we have to talk about too, 18.9 million of the poor people are white. That's 8 million more poor whites than poor blacks, 5 million more than Latino. And yet, why is it that the people benefiting most from food stamps, Medicaid, are white, but they elect politicians who represent those counties who vote against the programs that they're helping? What myth, what strategy is so powerful that it can make you vote against your own common sense? 90% of the so-called entitlement programs, according to the Center for Budget and Policy, goes to the elderly, the disabled, and the working poor. And yet politicians can use entitlement and say it like they're saying the N-word. So we must fight for families. But if we're to fight for families, we need a moral agenda, not a left-right agenda, a moral agenda that demands economic sustainability and ending poverty by securing pro-labor, anti-poverty policies that fight for full employment, living wages, the alleviation of disparate unemployment, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, strong safety nets for the poor, fair policies for immigrants, because if you don't have fair policies for immigrants, the status of immigrants not being able to get full immigration status are used to push down the wages for everybody else, and they pit one community against the other. We have to critique war policies that further disable our ability to have a real war on poverty. We have to focus on infrastructure development, because you cannot develop in communities without infrastructure and targeted empowerment zones. And we have to talk about fair tax reform that lifts the poor and the working poor and makes the wealthy pay their fair share. We're going to fight for families. We're going to have to fight for health care and tell the truth about health care. Harvard says for every five, and you know, we are not, most of us want it single payer. But, you know, we'll take the Affordable Care Act while we're fighting for single payer. And we'll take Medicaid expansion, because Harvard says that for every 500,000 people denied Medicaid expansion, 2,800 people are dying every year. You know, we ought to be upset when a cop shoots a person unarmed and assassinates them on the spot. But we also ought to be upset when a governor signs a bill and assassinates people in their sick bed. That's criminal. Criminal. And the 24 states have refused to expand Medicaid, most of them in the southern regions. Most of them. Refusing care for veterans, construction workers, healthcare workers. 8 million people without access to health insurance, most of them white. But blacks are being affected disproportionate per capita, because 6 out of 10 blacks live in the states that have denied Medicaid. What's going on when the governor that put her finger in Obama's face in Arizona will accept Medicaid, but the governor down in North Carolina won't accept Medicaid? Because when they say Medicaid down south, the way they say it, it's another way of using that old word without using it. And again, what myth is so strong that, as my grandmother said, will cause you to cut off your nose to spite your face. And so if we're going to fight for families, we got to fight for health care for all by assuring access to the Affordable Care Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, women's health. And we must fight for environmental protection, because they may have found water on Mars, but we still have to stay here. And then, thirdly, we're going to fight for families. We must fight for public education. Let us not forget that in 1785, not 1885, not 1985, but in 1785, U.S. President John Adams said the whole people must take upon themselves the education of the whole people and be willing to bear the expense of it. There should not be a district of 1 mile square without a school in it not funded by private money, by a charitable individual, but maintained at the public expense of the people themselves. He said that in 1785. Now, what always has caused that grand philosophy to get pushed back is when you enter race into the picture. Education and the care for our children is too big for a mere left-right debate. It's too big for a simple debate over conservative versus liberal. How we care for our children is a moral issue. Jesus said in one of his scriptures, it would be better for you to tie a cinder block around your neck and let somebody throw you out there in the Potomac than to offend one little person. One little person. Education and equality in education is a deeply moral issue. That's why any abdication of our deepest commitment to every child receiving access to a high-quality, well-funded public education is wrong. Even Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, knew that when he said, when you undermine public education and its funding, it is a threat to our national security. And so we must be the ones that say privatizing schools with public money will not get us where we need to be in America. Funding schools with property tax formulas that's inherently unequal cannot fulfill our deepest moral and constitutional vision. Accepting the fact that schools are resegregating today faster than they were in 1970, and that the combination of high poverty, resegregated schools is the greatest threat to public education, and attacking teachers relentlessly rather than supporting them, paying people millions of dollars to put a ball in a hoop or come over a goal, or at least to coach persons like that, and not paying teachers what they deserve is a tragedy. Restrictions on the use of race-based affirmative action in higher education, spiraling costs, and oftentimes having people who have black face now standing against the very programs that help them get where they are. It's troubling. It's a tragedy. And so we have to fight for equality, ensuring that every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education, as well as access to community college and universities by securing equitable funding also for minority colleges and universities. And then finally, we're gonna fight for families. Let's be real clear, y'all. The fact that as we sit in this room, Lionel, and I think about your mother and my father, and the battles down in a little place called Plymouth, North Carolina, just to vote down there, that as we sit here tonight in November of 2015, we have less voting rights protections than we had August 6, 1965. And if we're gonna have a movement for working families, it has to include an all-out fight for voting rights. Because denial, the abridgment and the denial of voting rights allows the oligarchy to rule and buy America. Voter suppression is an attack on families. It may be directed at black people and Latinos and students, but it is an attack on families. And there's no movement that's serious about the future of America and families, that's serious about it, that should not be pushing for the passage of the Voting Rights Amendment Act that Patrick Leahy and John Lewis. Now, I'm gonna tell it in Washington, D.C. There was a group of us that stood against the first bill, even though it was put on by our friends, because some of our friends wanted to give in to the Tea Party. So the first bill that they wanted to pass would have left North Carolina, Alabama, South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, even parts of New York uncovered. In other words, they said, this is all the Tea Party can give us. But I told one of them, I'm glad you didn't negotiate our freedom from slavery, because because you have to be able to talk strong to your friends too. I said, because it sounds like to me, if you had negotiated our freedom from slavery, all we would have gotten was a long weekend. So now we have a new bill, but every voting rights is labor rights. You can't fight for anything, healthcare, if you're not serious about voting, because especially when the same people voting to suppress the vote are also the same people telling us, and this is what they're running on, that the road to a great America is this direction. Cut money to public education, deny health care, deny unemployment, deny earned income tax credits, deny equal rights in a country of immigrants to immigrants, deny equal rights to our gay brothers and sisters, challenge the president on everything, refuse to even support him for what's good for America, desire war more than you desire diplomacy, This is what they're saying will give us a great America. Deny and abridge voting rights, distort the religious beliefs of other religion, use the so-called platform of true Christianity, which is nothing but heretical Americanity, to denounce other religions, especially Islam, and identify all Muslims as insane terrorists, the same way that white supremacists used to denounce all black men as brutes, beasts, and violence. And then, if you really want a great America, they are saying, even after Charleston and all of these other mass murders, make sure that everybody can get a gun easier than they can vote. That's what they're selling. And sometimes, Mary Kay, when I hear what they're selling, I don't get frustrated with them. Because if that's what they're selling, and we can't come together and challenge an agenda like that, they don't have the problem, we have the problem. So we end this. I've been too long, but let me go to my seat. In this moment, we must declare that the fight for families is on. Paul Ryan said in an interview the other day, he said, in America, it's not about bad people and bad policies. It's about a difference of opinion about how to go in the same direction. I beg to disagree. Isaiah said, woe unto those who legislate evil. There are some things that are just bad. They're wrong. There are some things that are morally indefensible, constitutionally inconsistent, and economically insane. And that's why we must make this a moral fight. And I want to challenge everywhere I go, my progressive brothers and sisters, that means we're going to have to change some of our language sometime. J. Cameron Carter, who wrote the book on the history and theology of racism at Duke, says that language is either a tool of liberation or a tool of suppression and subjugation. He said most of the time when the first people conquered another land, the first thing they did after taking the treasury and the library was to make the dominant language the language of the conquerors. Hear me if you're going to get in a fight. Don't ever let the dominant language of the fight be the language of the conquerors. So why do we keep using 17th century language out of the French Revolution to describe our current reality? That's where left-right comes from. Teach, Barber. Left-right. Left-right comes out of the French Revolution. The left didn't want the monarchy. The right wanted the monarchy. And so why are we using that language just because the talking heads on TV if we're trying to build a new movement? Huh? Why? Why do you call somebody right when you think they're wrong? That's linguistically troubling. You're confusing folk. But if we take moral language and start talking about what's moral, what's constitutional, then we can build a movement that has a different feel, that lets young people and old people know that if you get involved, you're really getting involved more than just for an election. You're getting involved to change the very soul, or matter of fact, to save the soul of the nation. And we need a movement that will have electoral results, not a movement just for elections. You hear what I'm saying? Charles Koch in 1973 did a speech, and he said, we're no longer going to invest in Messiah candidates. We're going to put our money in building movement from the bottom up. And I'd hate to tell you, but you can't build a movement just from D.C. Movements start from Birmingham and Selma up. You got to come down and then come up. Charles Koch said, we're going to invest our money down in building think tanks, taking over the radios, electing people from the school board up. We're going to build a movement that can punish our enemies and reward our friends. Then one article in the New York Times said, but progressives lost that. We forgot Dr. King told us the movement. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Build state-based movements that will have national impact, rooted in a deeply moral and a deeply constitutional and a fusion model. Go back. And instead, we started investing in Messiah candidates. The problem with that is, when the election is over, if they win, we say, go fix it. If they lose, all the apparatus goes home. And there's nothing left on the ground. But if you build a movement that says, we're coming together for the long haul, we're going to be working families, not Democrat or Republican. We're gonna be moral Monday, not Democrat or Republican. We're gonna be raised up 15, not Democrat or Republican. We're gonna come together and we're gonna stand together. And I close with this, my brothers. I know the power of standing together. Tomorrow Monday when we started, wasn't but 13 of us, but by the time it was over, 1,000 people had done civil disobedience in a southern state house more than any other time in the history of this country. And they were black, they were white, they were young, they were old, they were Asian, they were Latino, they were gay, they were straight, they were Republican, and they were Democrat. And I'm telling you, when we started, the governor, we haven't won some electoral things yet, but just keep watching. When we started, the governor was at 50% in the poll. Now he's at 30% and falling. When we started, the legislature was at 40% in the poll. Now they're at 19 and falling. When we started, the issues we supported were all polling under 40%. But as we changed the debate and changed the consciousness, now all of those issues are polling at 50, 60, and some are 70%. Since we've been working, we've had 5 new branches of the NAACP, all white, out in the western part of the state, up in the mountain. And you know when mountain white folk and black folk get together, that's nothing but a miracle. I know the power. I know the power of working together. I know the power of working together biblically, because when you look at the scriptures, for those of you that still read it, because when Moses and his people and that rod came together, Pharaoh came down and the Red Sea opened up. When Esther and her uncle Mordecai came together, they were able to stop the plots against the Jewish people. When Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, or as my daddy used to say, that bad Negro, came together, they were able to shut the fire in the furnace down and stand up to Nebuchadnezzar. When David and his rock and his slingshot and his faith came together, Goliath fell. And the next morning in the Jerusalem Post, it read, the bigger they come, the harder they fall. I know the power of coming together. I know what it says in the Tomorrow Monday movement. I know what it says in the Bible, but I also know what it says in history. The truth is, when you look at history, justice has never lost. I didn't say justice hadn't been fought. I didn't say justice hadn't been beaten up. I didn't say justice hadn't been scarred, but justice has never lost. During slavery, it looked like justice had lost. But when Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and some Quakers and some white abolitionists, evangelicals got together, they formed a fusion movement and they brought about abolition. Women didn't have the right to vote, but when Sojourner Truth and Elizabeth Canton Staton, one black, one white, came together in the 1840s, eventually they won the right to vote. Plessy versus Ferguson looked like it had the victory. But when Thurgood Marshall got white lawyers and black lawyers and Jewish lawyers all in the same place, and they used the dissent of Justice Harlan from 1896, they won an all-white Supreme Court in this city with one member who had been a part of the KKK voted unanimously to pull down separate but equal, but they had to come together. It looked like Jim Crow had beaten down justice and it wouldn't rise again. But when Rosa Parks and Martin King and Bayard Rustin, who by the way was gay, and Glenn Smiley and Jonathan Daniels and a white woman from Detroit, Viola Russa, came together, they tore down Jim Crow. I know it biblically. I know it historically. I know it through Tomorrow Monday. When you come together. So that's why they're fighting us so hard, Brother Shelton. That's why they're fighting us so hard, Mary Kay. That's why we're getting death threats down in North Carolina, because they know that if you have to stack the courts and suppress the vote and unleash pornographic sums of money just to win, you really don't have a winning game. And you just hoping that the other side doesn't realize how weak you really are. And they know if we come together, we are some bad somebodies. You mess around and let working families and fight Raise Up 15 and Tomorrow Monday and the unions, and then a coalition of progressive prophets of Muslims and Jews and Christians come together, my God, we are some bad folk. And I know it works. Let me tell you finally how I know coming together works. Some years ago, some said I'd never walk again. You saw McCain over there, came up, had to grab the place on the side of that rail right there. They said I'd never walk again. Said I'd never get out of the wheelchair, Lana. I was 30 years old. I had always depended on my leg. Played football with your brother. Used to block for him. He was a running back. I was a back. Thought I would always have my leg. One morning, woke up, couldn't move. Went to the hospital, spent 3 months in a bed. They thought I had cancer in my leg. Wasn't that. They found out I had a chronic disease. I didn't know if I'd ever have my legs back. Left the hospital on a walker, dragging myself. Still went back in the pulpit, still preached, still tried to baptize. Only time I didn't hurt was when I was baptizing and preaching. But otherwise, it felt like somebody had a butcher knife right in my left hip. And over 12 years, I went through depression. I got down on myself. But something happened. Something happened. My mind got together. And then my doctors and my nurses got together. And then the pharmacists got together. And then my swim coach got together. And then my therapist got together. And then my nutritionist got together. And then the prayer warriors got together. And my faith got together. And look here, I can walk now. All I'm trying to tell you, I know if we come together, if we fight together, we can change America. If we fight together, we can save families. If we fight together, we can make a difference. If we fight together, we can make America one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I don't even want to say thank you after that. But I do want to say that I think I speak for everybody here when I say that there is no one in America now whose vision and eloquence and moral courage and movement building serves as a greater inspiration to all of us when we flag for even a second than Reverend William Barber. Thank you so much.